Chapter 20. If happiness is something we do, then what activity is it? For I ask all men whether they would prefer to have joy in truth or in falsehood. They hesitate no more in preferring the truth than in wishing for happiness itself. We have reached a sensitive point. I am about to argue that consummate happiness must lie in union with God. In fact, that happiness lies in the mind's gaze upon Him, in His own being, and what He is in Himself. Unacceptable! Isn't that what Christians say? If the argument converged on a Sufi or a Buddhist conclusion, perhaps no one would object. These days, Christianity arouses protests. Notice, though, that even though this chapter will arrive at something that Christians believe, it will make no use of Christianity to get there. So I promise those who suffer visceral responses to the claims of faith that for now, at least, their viscera are safe. I don't promise not to endanger their viscera later. The argument can be stated in a few sentences, and the only reason for expanding them to the length of a chapter is to respond to a few inevitable objections. Not to all possible objections, of course. New objections can always be raised to any argument whatsoever. New objections can be raised to any of the replies to the objections. The inability to think of still more objections may prove that the objector lacks imagination, but it is not a reasonable test of an argument's cogency. There is no escape from the need to exercise judgment. Let's get started then. In the last chapter, we concluded that happiness is an activity. What activity is it? The word activity is related to the word actualize, and this is no accident. An activity brings into actuality some power or potentiality that would otherwise be only latent. Eating actualizes or fulfills the nutritive power. Breathing actualizes or fulfills the respiratory power. We don't just happen to have these powers. We have them for the sake of their actualization. Each of them is for something. So to ask, in what activity does happiness lie, amounts to asking, of what power or powers is happiness the actualization or fulfillment? The very idea that natural powers may have purposes that can be attained, fulfilled, or actualized is deeply objectionable to some people. In fact, denial of natural purposes is pretty well drummed into us today because our education is so steeped in materialism. It is supposed to be unscientific to believe in natural purposes. In order to explain why this objection is wrong, let me address its three main variations. One version of the objection is that attributing natural purposes to things is a form of animism, like attributing deliberation and will to a rock, a river, or the wind. But I am not doing anything of that sort. To say that the purpose of the heart is to pump blood is not to make the ridiculous claim that the heart has a will of its own, and that its intention is to keep the blood moving. It is merely to say that the heart both accomplishes something and exists to accomplish it. Unlike a deliberating mind, the heart is not thinking about the matter. It only acts as though it were. We use the same word for purposes in minds and for purposes in things because they are analogous, not because they are identical. Another version of the objection is that although thinking of inanimate things as having purposes may once have led to interesting discoveries, science has gotten beyond all that now. But science has not, in fact, gotten beyond all that. Fields as diverse as optics and quantum mechanics make extensive use of what physicists and mathematicians call variational principles, according to which systems tend to behave in such ways as to minimize, maximize, or hold constant certain quantities. For example, a beam of light passing through a prism seeks the path that minimizes the optical distance, which is the physical distance multiplied by the angle of refraction. Materialists dislike saying that the light seeks the path of least optical distance because the term seeks is suggestive of a mind with a will. To avoid that suggestion, they prefer to say that the prism makes the light bend. It is hard to see what they gain by this. If we are not allowed to use language that might remind us of minds, then the language of seeking something and the language of making something do something ought to be equally suspect. Let's just say that light beams, prisms, and other things act as though they had minds, even though they don't, and let it go at that. Still another version of the argument is not so much materialistic as skeptical. It says not that there aren't any natural purposes, but that we can't know them, because only the maker of something knows what it is for. I know the purposes of my own works, such as the house that I've built, because I know my own mind. I don't know the purposes of natural things, such as eyes, because the Creator made them, and how can I read His mind? But I don't need to read the divine mind to know what eyes are for. I only need to know, 1, that eyes see, and 2, that I can't even explain why I have eyes in the first place without referring to this fact. The reason for the existence of eyes is to enable me to see. We were asking, of what power or powers is happiness the fulfillment or actualization? Presumably, it would be our highest powers. Why? Because those are the ones that define us. I am most myself, most in tune with my nature, not when I am employing the lower powers that I share with the plants and beasts, such as eating, growing, or receiving sense impressions, but when I am employing the higher powers that distinguish me from them, such as deliberating about what to do, or trying to ascertain the truth about something. This is why, even though both our higher and lower powers are true aspects of us, we don't compliment ourselves for self-command when our minds obey our passions, but when our passions cooperate with our minds. And this is why, even though we are more than naked minds, we view the decisions and conclusions of our minds as the decisions and conclusions of our whole selves. The man who is ruled by his feelings and appetites is in bondage. Against this view, 3 arguments are offered. 1. Reason is not the highest power because it cannot rule the passions. 2. Reason is not the highest power because it should not rule the passions. And 3. It doesn't matter which element of us rules, because nature does not know any higher or lower. Let us consider these in turn. We have already seen a proponent of the first objection in Chapter 9. David Hume, who called reason the slave of the passions, and said that it could never pretend to any other function than to serve and obey them. But as we also saw there, Hume's argument is circular. He first defined all impulses that affect the will as passions, and then said that only passions can affect the will. The supposed tyranny of feelings is certainly convenient. It provides us with an excuse for doing whatever we want. When challenged about our choices, we need only say, I can't help how I feel, and I feel I have no choice. But it is a fallacy. The second objection, not that the passions inevitably do rule, but that they should, had an apostle in the poet, John Keats. Oh, for a life of sensations rather than of thoughts. And we all know how the galaxy was saved when Luke Skywalker finally followed the advice of Obi-Wan Kenobi. Luke, trust your feelings. Heaven forbid that he should have trusted his judgment. This idea that the feelings should rule has numerous variations, each proposing a different kind of feeling as the ruler. Moralists propose moral feelings. Religious folk of the emotional sort propose religious feelings. Hedonists, pleasant feelings. Aesthetes, beautiful feelings. Romantics, ecstatic feelings. And transgressivists, morbid or forbidden feelings. Transgressivism being the point to which all romantics come if they follow the romantic path to the end. For if the feeling that you crave comes from crossing normal boundaries, then eventually you will have to cross the boundaries of normal feeling. But the problem is the same in each case. The passions that are nominated as rulers are themselves in need of rule. So the second objection is mistaken too. The third objection was that it doesn't matter which element of us rules because nature doesn't know any higher or lower, that such distinctions are imposed upon nature from outside. But are they? Plants have only such powers as growing and absorbing nutrition. Beasts have these, but also additional ones. For example, the power of perceiving things through their senses. Human beings rise still higher, for we have rational powers. Not only can we perceive things through our senses, but we can grasp universals. For example, we can know not just a good taste, but the idea of good taste, and in fact the idea of good in general. Moreover, not only can we seek things according to instinct, but we can deliberate. So the sensitive powers rank above the vegetative powers, but the rational powers are still higher. It makes no more sense to deny the reality of higher and lower powers than of higher and lower mountains. Consider, too, that plants seek their ends automatically, without even knowing what they are seeking. Animals know their ends, in the sense that they pursue them, but they do not know them in a reflective sense, for they do not even grasp the concept of an end. We not only pursue our ends, but also know that they are ends. We experience them not just as felt impulses, but as meanings, as rational purposes, as reasons for doing what we do. Rationality is more, much more than being clever or knowing many things. One can even imagine a beast that is cleverer than we are, knows far more than we do, and can do many more things than we can, yet is not rational. For rationality takes the lower powers up into reason, brings them into partnership with reason, imbues them with sense and context. We seek not bare life, but a human life, which is a considered life. We not only respond to our inclinations, but regulate them, wonder about them, and inquire into them, just as we wonder about all things, until we find their meaning, until we are in accord with this meaning through and through. We cannot be at rest. Suppose, then, we agree that happiness must lie in an activity of our highest power, and that our highest power is reason. Is our work done? No. There is one step more, because our fulfillment would have to lie in the highest activity of our highest power, and reason has more than one activity. One of its activities is practical. We deliberate about and organize our lives. The other is contemplative. We also seek and reflect upon the truth. Which of these two is highest? Practical reasoning may seem highest because, as we have seen, even the fragmentary and imperfect happiness of this life depends on the exercise of the virtues, and the virtue of prudence, or practical wisdom, is the one that sets all the other virtues in proper order. That is nothing to snort at. But on closer examination, practical reason couldn't be reason's highest activity, for doing presupposes knowing. Even the most hard-headed person wants to organize his life in accordance with what is really true. Don't we, in fact, try to do so, even if we aren't always thinking about it, and even if our assumptions about the truth are wrong? If someone were to become convinced that his whole life had been based on a delusion, he would fall into despondency. That is the point of the quotation from Augustine that I placed as the epigraph to this chapter. For even though we profoundly desire joy, we are no more hesitant to prefer truth than we are to desire joy itself. Ignorance may produce the illusion of bliss, but ignorance is not bliss. Leave that to the cows and the sheep. We are men and women. The curious thing about us is that we desire knowledge not just to guide our deliberation, but also for its own sake. And it is more than curious, isn't it? In this desire lies much of the nobility of the human creature. All men by nature desire to know, writes Aristotle. An indication of this is the delight we take in our senses, he explains. For even apart from their usefulness, they are loved for themselves, and above all, others the sense of sight. For not only with a view to action, but even when we are not going to do anything, we prefer seeing, one might say, to everything else. The reason is that this, most of all the senses, makes us know and brings to light many differences between things. Even shabby tabloid journalism exploits our desire to know truth. The National Enquirer catapulted itself to greater prominence in the 1980s by means of the advertising slogan, "Inquiring minds want to know." You would think that the tabloid's marketing experts had read Aristotle. More likely, they were capitalizing on the obvious. But just as our highest rational power is directed to knowing, not just doing, so some objects of knowledge are higher than others. Wouldn't it be the case, then, that the highest activity of our highest power would lie not in knowing the most trivial and base objects of knowledge, but its very highest and noblest objects, especially the truth about God? For what activity of our minds could be higher than to see God, to know Him as He is in Himself? At this point, another objection might be proposed, for it may seem implausible that happiness lies in any kind of knowledge, if we understand knowledge as the grasping of abstractions, the way an intellectual knows the proof of theorem, which does, by the way, seem to be how the thinker Aristotle viewed the happiness of contemplation. Two different responses to this objection are possible. One response is that it underestimates the joy that those capable of understanding abstractions do take in grasping them, but I admit that most of us find this response unconvincing. It would make happiness very much the business of an intellectual elite, such as mathematicians or philosophers, and there are an awful lot of unhappy mathematicians and philosophers, aren't there? The other response is more compelling. When we say that happiness is a kind of knowledge, we should be thinking not so much of mathematicians or philosophers, but of lovers. The happiness of knowing God would not be the happiness the intellectual has in knowing a theorem or abstraction, but rather the kind of happiness the lover has in knowing the beloved. But in this case, the knowledge would be perfect and all-consuming, and the beloved would be the infinitely lovable, the divine source of all good and beauty, the origin of love itself. The vision of God would seize and consume us, and this response seems satisfying. Even now, I am not yet making a faith claim. The argument to this point is simply reasonable. For consider, there has to be a first cause, a first reason. Otherwise, we cannot explain why there is anything else. The village atheist who says, "Oh yeah, if God created everything, who created God?" merely betrays his misunderstanding of the argument. Things that don't have to be, contingent beings, require causes. Things that have to be, necessary beings, do not require causes. God is not a thing among others to be explained. He is that without which nothing is explainable. To reject Him, then, is to say that there don't have to be reasons for things, that in the end nothing has to make sense. Pagan mythology was more or less explicit about nothing making sense. It didn't picture the first reason creating all things from nothing, and then calling all things back to Himself. Rather, it pictured the gods themselves inexplicably coming from the void. Since everything was held up by nothing, ultimately nothing was held up at all. To believe in the first reason is the very opposite of believing in that kind of God. This sort of God is the very precondition of things making sense. And let us be very clear. No one who believes that things don't have to make sense has any business saying that anything at all is true or false, or that anything does or does not exist. For how would he know? Do not reproach me with chaos theory. What mathematicians call chaos is not things not making sense, or not possessing order. Rather, it has to do with the limits of prediction in certain kinds of highly ordered systems. The study of such systems does not require the abandonment of reason. And so at the end of this chapter we arrive at the conclusion that the beginning of the chapter foreshadowed. There is no higher activity than seeing God, knowing Him as the lover knows the beloved, face to face. But there is another difficulty, a more serious one, to which we now turn. Chapter 21. Can we do it on our own? Are thy wonders known in the darkness? Granted that happiness is the highest activity or fulfillment of our highest power. Granted that this activity would lie in the highest and noblest object of knowledge, granted that that object is God, and granting God's reality, there is still a further question: can we know Him? It may seem that doing so would utterly exceed our abilities. It would be very easy to misunderstand the objection I am raising here, so first, let's consider some things I do not mean. First, in saying that such knowledge would utterly exceed our abilities, I am not suggesting that nothing about God is rationally knowable. In fact, such a claim would be incoherent, for to know that nothing about God is rationally unknowable would be to know something about Him, wouldn't it? In fact, it would be to know a great deal about Him. We would have to know that even if He existed, He was infinitely remote, because otherwise one could not be so sure that knowledge about Him was rationally inaccessible. We would have to know that even if He existed, He was unconcerned with human beings, because otherwise we would expect Him to have provided the means for humans to know Him. We would have to know that even if He existed, He was completely unlike the biblical portrayal of Him, in which He does care about us, and has already provided such means. So in the end, the agnostic must claim to know quite a number of things about God, just to prop up his claim to not knowing any. The question for him is this: how can he rationally justify his claim to know all those things, since he also claims that he can't know them? It turns out that he is really saying that nothing about God is rationally knowable except the things that would have to be true for him to keep saying that nothing else about Him is rationally knowable. Why the exceptions? If the agnostic can't know the other things, how can he know these? It is all suspiciously arbitrary. Second, I am not suggesting that nothing about God is knowable except by means of faith or revelation. In fact, without recourse to faith or revelation, this book has already commented on a few of the numerous reasons to believe that God exists. One is that for every natural desire, there exists a possible satisfaction of that desire. Since there exists a profound natural longing that cannot be satisfied by anything in the natural order, that which satisfies it must exceed the natural order. Another is that if things that don't have to exist do need causes, then the entire ensemble of causes and effects must have a cause, and the first cause couldn't be just one more contingent being, but would have to exist necessarily. As we have seen, to deny that contingent things need causes is to pull such a long thread from the fabric of reasoning that the whole garment comes unraveled. A third is that since unintelligent things cannot direct themselves according to their purposes, the purposeful order we see in nature must have been arranged by some being that does have intelligence. Even if order among living things emerged from natural selection, as some people suggest, natural selection requires a universe that is already ordered a certain way in which to operate, and it is ordered that way, for as we have also seen, teleological principles are evident in the rest of the physical universe too. Besides, proponents of natural selection recognize that the process of selection operates only on self-replicating things, such as living organisms. Without elaborating, a few more of the reasons to believe that God exists might be mentioned just by way of illustration. There is the fact that reality has the amazing property of making sense to minds. Why should it? Unless this is just wildly good luck, which seems implausible, it must itself be the product of a mind. Then there is the fact that there are moral laws. We couldn't have made them. We can't even change them. Therefore, there must exist a moral lawmaker. I owe the shortest argument to philosophers Peter Kraft and Ronald Tuchelli. There is the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. Therefore, there must be a God. Kraft and Tuchelli remark, "You either see this one or you don't." That understates its force, for either beauty is a real thing, which cannot be explained on materialistic terms, or else it is an illusion, which cannot be explained on materialistic terms either, since such an illusion would have no adaptive value for us. Third, I am not suggesting that reason tells us nothing about God but the bare fact of his existence. The sorts of arguments we have been considering point not just to the bare existence of God, but to a great many of his attributes. He is the Creator. There is only one of him, or else creation itself would lack the coherence that we recognize in it. He is not a contingent, but a necessary being. That is, he can't not be. He is the ultimate explanation of all else that is. He is not a blind force, as in Star Wars, but a personal mind. He is the source of order, meaning, beauty, moral law, and good. Nor need we worry about whether he created evil too, because evil has no nature of its own, but can arise only by a disorder or lack in something good. And since he is the ultimate object of longing, he is our ultimate good. All this and much more we can work out just by reasoning. If I am not saying any of those three things, what then am I saying? Simply that there is an inconceivably great gap between knowing about God and knowing God. To know God is to be taken up into his own interior life. To know something about God may be crucial to knowing God, but in itself such knowledge may be as dead as chalk dust on a blackboard. The difference between knowing and knowing about is plain, even in our everyday lives. I may know that Sandra exists. I may know that she is beautiful, that she is of such and such an age, and that she is so and so many inches tall. I may even know something about her virtues and talents. And yet, even knowing all this, I may not know Sandra. So it is with God, but far more so. By reason, we can work out God's existence and many of his attributes, but knowing these falls far short of knowing God. The mind of the first cause would be so much higher than our minds that his mind and our minds could be given the same name, minds, only by analogy. Our minds perceive created things. His mind brings them about. Our thoughts have truth only by corresponding with how things really are. Things are what they are only because they correspond with his thoughts. Since our minds are made for knowing things within the natural order, how can we possibly know that which lies above the natural order and causes it to be? We have no more conception of God's mind than a dog has of his master's, or than a character in a play has of the mind of the author. The latter analogy is not perfect, because the characters in a novel are not real persons, but only depictions of persons. Even so, it has the merit of calling our attention to the vast gulf between a created being and the uncreated being, by whom all created reality is made. Or consider the difference between the good things we know in this life and the infinite source of good. Begin with just one of the goods we know. Love. I know the love of biological fatherhood, but God is the creator of biology. I know the love of man and woman, but God is the creator of the sexes. I know the love of friendship, but God created in me the desire and potentiality for friendship with another of my kind. I may say that these loves must somehow reflect his love or stand in analogy to his love, and I am sure this is correct. But although in most cases the gap between an original and a copy, between a thing and the thing to which it is compared, is finite, in this case it is infinite, and transcends the capacity of the copy to conceive. Consider, too, that everything that we embodied beings understand is mediated to us through our senses. Water pours through my fingers, cools my skin, and slakes my thirst. From particular instances of sensing water, I form the universal concept, water. But how is God to be mediated to us through our senses? Is the creator of surface and substance a thing to be felt? Is the creator of light and color a thing to be seen? Seeing him is another analogy. It means comprehending him. I grasp realities with my mind and call it seeing them. But what will illuminate for me the very light by which I see? It is beginning to look as though the desire of which we have spoken, the desire that cannot be satisfied by anything within the natural order, cannot be satisfied at all, because the natural order is the limit of what we can attain. We are no more likely to lift ourselves up to the beatific vision than to suspend ourselves in the air by pulling up on our trousers. Is that our plight? And there is another difficulty, too. So far in this chapter, we have been speaking as though the difficulty in knowing God were purely intellectual. For isn't knowing an activity of the mind? Yes, but knowing is not a technique like making soup or carving wooden whistles. We do not say that only the pure in heart shall make soup, but, according to an ancient tradition, only the pure in heart shall see God. I do not offer this tradition as something to be accepted on faith, but as something that commends itself to the mind. It is not merely possible or plausible, but strongly probable. For purity of heart is like clear vision. My eye cannot see if other things are in the way. In the same way, my mind cannot know God, unless with a single heart I desire God. Aren't we all too well aware that our desires can be deflected and disordered by the attractions of lesser things? Besides, if God is indeed good, just, and the author of goodness and justice, then wouldn't impure and disordered desires that oppose His own will be absolute barriers to knowing Him? The suggestion is not that nothing else but God should be desired or pursued, but that nothing else should be desired in preference to Him, or pursued in a way that interferes with pursuing Him. Thou hast made us for Thyself, wrote Augustine, and our hearts are restless till they rest in Thee. One would think this would settle the matter, but even if our minds can rest nowhere but in Him, we may certainly believe that they can rest apart from Him, or we may have weak wills and divided hearts, believing in theory that Augustine is right, and yet acting as though he isn't. For on one hand is God, whom I cannot perceive with my senses, or, apparently, fully possess in this life. On the other is the charming, shapely, and available married lady next door, whom I perceive all too well with my senses, and can possess, so she tells me, in the next 60 minutes. Looking honestly at the scale, God wins hands down. But if my senses put their heavy thumb on the other pan, what then? I may not even be looking at the pans. I may be murmuring to myself like Scarlett O'Hara, I'll think about that tomorrow. My example should not be misunderstood. Though the lady next door is a carnal temptation, the disorder in my desires, the deflection from my ultimate good, does not have to be carnal. Consider the spiritual temptation of having no one to whom we must answer but ourselves. Atheists are fond of saying that belief in God is a crutch, a comfort for weak minds who find life too difficult. But disbelieving in Him can also be a crutch, a comfort for deluded minds who think that they will be freer if they are alienated from the divine source of their freedom. Or consider the temptation of renown. In recent years, we have seen numerous instances of scholars and scientists deliberately falsifying data for the glory of spurious discoveries. What could they have been thinking? How could they rejoice in the glory of recognition for what they knew to be false? Yet they did. For yet another, consider the temptation to be dishonest in order to avoid calamity. Perhaps I have nothing to show for my research, but unless I come up with something quickly, I will lose my grant. I promise myself that next time I will be honest. But lies metastasize because all knowledge is connected. To cover up the first lie, I must tell more lies. The greater the original lie, the more the covering lies take on a life of their own. Before long, deception mutates into self-deception, for to relieve the dreadful weight of lying to all those other people, I begin to tell lies to myself. Soon I must tell more lies to cover up those lies, too. But I haven't done those things. Maybe not. Then what things have you done? Would you wish your most secret thoughts to be audible to others, or the deeds that give you the greatest shame to be displayed on your forehead? My life is an open book, is a boast that can be made only by those utterly ignorant of themselves. Notwithstanding the fact that human effort can go a long way toward virtue, even the most exemplary among us are deeply flawed. G.K. Chesterton famously quipped that original sin is the only part of Christian theology which can really be proved. He was not referring to the story in Genesis, but to the obvious fact that there is something wrong with us, a fact as practical as potatoes. The disgrace of it all lies not in the baseness of human nature, but in its nobility. We trade solid gold for gilt paint. We honeycomb our hearts with desires that oppose our deepest longings. We demand to have happiness on terms that make happiness impossible. We have no excuse. Worst of all, we seem powerless to fix our own distemper. Or are we? Chapter 22. Could we ever do it on our own? But the serpent said to the woman, You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. In the previous chapter, we concluded that human nature, in its present state, is both intellectually and morally incapable of seeing God. Now the road forks. Down the right-hand fork, we might ask whether assistance of some sort is possible from God himself. Turning to the left-hand fork, we might ask whether we may be able to assist ourselves, whether it may be possible to uplift our own nature without any help from him at all. Earlier, I compared this possibility with lifting ourselves by our bootstraps. But could it be that this dismissal was premature? Might some kind of bootstrapping really be possible? We might call the right-hand fork divine, the left-hand fork transhumanist. Since the transhumanist option has received so much attention in recent years, let us consider it first. I assure those who have never heard of transhumanism that I am not making all this up. Now, presumably, since the deficiency that keeps us back from beatitude is both intellectual and moral, the transhumanist solution would have to be both intellectual and moral. Not only would we have to change the nature of our intellects, we would also have to change the nature of our desires. On the one hand, we would have to attain such godlike minds that human self-knowledge became the practical equivalent of the knowledge of God, whatever that may mean. And on the other, we would have to redesign the rest of our nature so that we determined for ourselves the conditions of human flourishing. We would reconfigure our longings, no longer pining for what we could not have, like dogs howling at the moon. We would no longer have to be good. To put it another way, we would decide for ourselves what counts as good. This fork in the road is not new. Our most ancient traditions not only speak of it, but warn of it. The best known of them maintains that when confronted with this choice, the earliest humans yielded to the temptation to partake without permission of the knowledge of good and evil, so that they would be like God. The outcome is represented as having been disastrous. But it seems that the lesson did not take because, according to another such legend, as soon as men learned to make buildings from bricks and mortar, they resolved to build a tower with its top in the heavens, in order to make a name for themselves and unite human strength so that they would never be scattered over the face of the earth. At a stroke, the story goes, their plans were reduced to futility and confusion, and they were dispersed over the earth, so that the very thing they had hoped to prevent came about. Stylish modern impatience with ancient literary devices, such as talking snakes and towers reaching to the heavens, misses the point of such warnings. The classical interpreters did not read the legend of Babel as meaning that we should not make tall buildings, but that we must approach God through humility rather than pride. They did not read the story of the fall as meaning that we should avoid conversations with reptiles, but that no created being is the measure of its own knowledge. God's thoughts originate reality and the finite possibilities of good that it contains. Our thoughts can never do more than reflect that reality. The first humans may have thought that they could originate for themselves new and different measures of what is to count as good and evil, but they ended up learning only the good they had lost and the evil into which they had fallen. As these traditions show, the temptation to thumb our noses at God and try to become gods ourselves is as old as the human race and continually recurs. Consider, for instance, the ruminations of Friedrich Nietzsche, who thought all it takes to rise above the human level is disillusionment and strength of will. He was convinced that the belief in objectively true values, a real good and evil, a real right and wrong, even a real reality, was finally petering out. Not much belief was left in the tank. Soon it would run dry. The age of nihilism would begin. One result of this emptiness would be the rise of the herd creatures he called the last men, people who would no longer believe in anything or aspire to anything, and who therefore might believe carelessly in anything, but who would know, more or less, what they wanted. Above all, they would want their lives to be comfortable, safe, easy, and just like everyone else's. Another result would be the rise of a few exceptional individuals who would in some sense be more than human, men who, instead of receiving values from a supposedly transcendent source, such as God, would create their own values, imposing them on those weaker than themselves. Creating their own values would be tantamount to creating their own reality. For since purposes are built into things, good can be what it is only if the rest of reality is what it is. In some unimaginable sense, Nietzsche thought the various supermen would war among themselves over the question of whose values and facts would prevail. Finally, when some of them were able to impose a new order of reality, the specter of the abyss would retreat. Not, mind you, that the abyss itself would retreat. There would merely be no horror in it. Ironically, the sort of people who prattle about creating their own values have turned out to be exactly the sort of people whom Nietzsche despised as last men. The would-be supermen turn out to live in herds, bleating, free at last, true for you, but not for me." Let each person have his own reality, right along with his own new car and entertainment center. If God is dead, then everything is, hey, whatever. So the age of nihilism that Nietzsche prophesied has come upon us. But it is not, as he thought, a story of last men and supermen. It is only another chapter in the story of futile attempts to build towers with their top in the heavens. Consider today's high-tech transhumanists, who rely not on the will to power, but on imagined future techniques of nanotechnology, biotechnology, and the cognitive and information sciences, tools with which they think we will one day be able to redesign and reconstruct our very nature. If we wish, we will be able to adjust people to their particular lots in life in order to enhance their performance and satisfaction. We can have file clerks who never get bored, laborers who never go on strike, and miners who prefer the heat, dust, and dark. Perhaps it is not hard to see that such manipulations would not enhance but diminish us. Yet some people find this point difficult to grasp. Why, they ask, should anyone have to be a square peg in a round hole? But that is an odd way to put the question. Rather, we should ask, why should all our corners be cut off? Wouldn't it be better to leave us alone and change the shape of the hole? No, say the transhumanists. Life could be more to our liking. Everyone could be smarter. Everyone could be stronger. Everyone could be more musical. And why stop there? Everyone could live forever, even if that meant putting an end to having children, a point Europe has almost reached anyway. No one need ever become depressed, even if he had something to be depressed about. No one need ever suffer bad dreams or pangs of conscience, no matter what he had done. No one need ever go mad from not knowing the meaning of his life, for our minds could be readjusted So we thought we knew it already, or didn't care whether we knew, or believed that there was none and didn't care about that either. War would come to an end, because nations would peacefully submit to whatever their programmers decided to have them submit to. Or war would not come to an end, but we would be adjusted to that too, and like it. Transhumanists believe the superhuman future is inevitable. Suppose your children are the only ones in the school without brain implants for concentration on tests. You wouldn't want them to fall behind, would you? As two promoters of the hoped-for revolution explained in the Wall Street Journal, a publication not otherwise given to wild-eyed prognostication, even if parents don't invest in brain implants, the military will. Challenging reluctant readers, they ask, who could blame a general for wanting a soldier with hypernormal focus, a perfect memory for maps, and no need to sleep for days on end? Chillingly, they add, of course, spies might well also try to eavesdrop on such a soldier's brain, and hackers might want to hijack it. But the prospect isn't chilling to them. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted, they croon. It belongs to the brave. The authors comment that DARPA, the Pentagon's Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, is already looking into these matters. In fact, various government agencies and private sector organizations have been looking into them for decades. At a conference co-sponsored some years ago by the National Science Foundation and the Department of Commerce, papers were contributed not only by those two agencies, but also by the Office of Science and Technology Policy, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, the National Institutes of Health, the American Enterprise Institute, Hewlett-Packard, and the Institute for Global Futures. Transhumanist ideology is even getting into the curriculum. On one occasion, I accompanied the freshmen in one of my courses to a university event designed to help undergraduates choose majors. One of the speakers was an enthusiastic physics professor who boasted that someday we would be able to upload our minds into computers, thereby living without the limitations of physical bodies. This was his argument for choosing physics as a major. It was inconceivable to him that anyone wouldn't want to get in on the ground floor of such exciting developments. If such things horrify you, the transhumanist replies that your horrors can be readjusted. He believes that what we call a human being is just a sophisticated mechanism. What we call its nature is merely its operating system. What we call its consciousness is only its executive function. And what we call its deepest longings are but the objectives built into its program. Fulfillment can therefore have no other meaning than continual success in attaining what our programming leads us most strongly and persistently to desire. In the spirit of the legends, we might say to the transhumanist that we cannot displace the Creator because we cannot reinvent our humanity. But the transhumanist will reply, why can't we? Why can't we provide ourselves with an improved human nature, not this old Paleolithic hand-me-down, but a new one we make for ourselves? Rather than thinking of human nature as what we are, transhumanists think of our nature as a shackle on what we are, and what we are can be anything. You may think that I am painting an exaggerated picture of what transhumanists want. Whether or not one cares for the idea of rewiring soldiers so that they don't have to sleep, it isn't the same as trying to become gods. Really? Becoming gods is an admitted goal of some transhumanists. Physicist and biotech entrepreneur Richard Seed boasted, God made man in his own image. We are going to become one with God. We are going to have almost as much knowledge and almost as much power as God. Cloning and the reprogramming of DNA is the first serious step in becoming one with God. Tulane University physicist Frank J. Tipler has gone even further, arguing that through the advance of science, intelligent species will literally evolve into God. Yes, he really says this. Three incoherencies lie at the murky heart of the transhumanist program. Two of them were pointed out several generations ago by C.S. Lewis. before transhumanism was a movement, before it had a name, when it was hardly more than a cloudy presupposition of certain ways of speaking about the future, when it did not even speak explicitly of man becoming God. The third has to do especially with man becoming God, and therefore goes straight to the heart of the matter. First, according to transhumanist ideology, the time has come for man to decide what man shall become. As Lewis pointed out, this language is misleading, for it is really a proposal for some men to decide what other men shall become. If some people are to be changed, then others must change them. Even in the most democratic version of the ideology, which bids us think not of military, industrial, political, or ideological imperatives, but only of parents choosing to enhance their children, the present generation arrogates to itself the power to decide what portion of the human inheritance future generations will be allowed to retain. Second, if we really have no essential nature, if human beings can be turned into anything, then there is no possible basis left for deciding what they should be turned into. For if the natural law itself can be rewritten, then how can any plan for rewriting it be better than any other? First, we erase the slate. Then we write on it. But a blank slate cannot tell you what should be written on itself. To give permission to redesign our minds and deepest longings is to say that the motives our minds and longings supply to us now should be set aside. Having set them aside, the redesigners could have no other guide for their actions than the impulses they happen to feel at the moment of making the plan. Third, and most fundamental, the idea that a creature could evolve into the creator, that dependent beings could turn into absolute being, is so muddled that one hardly knows how to argue with it. It is like saying that if only my powers become great enough, I will someday become my own father and beget myself on my mother. How have we become so confused about what a nature is that we have come to believe that we can make one? I do not suppose that proponents of this ideology can achieve what they desire. I do think they might do great damage by trying. The brave new technologies of the transhumanists would enable man not to transcend himself, but only to destroy himself. Humans, so-called, would be artifacts, made things, constructs, like television sets or digging machines. The engineers would dream of being God, and the rest of us would dream of being engineers, always supposing that dreams had not been engineered out of us, too. And for what? All to forestall the necessity of relying on God to know God. It is like saying, you need not drink water. Whenever you are dry, take this pill. It will produce the illusion of drinking and suppress your thirst. But what if the pill works perfectly? Then one dies of dehydration, a perfectly desiccated, smugly self-satisfied mummy.